It's been about a year since I made my initial critique on Half-Life Alyx. I figured it was high time to return to the topic, given the number of criticisms I've received over the intervening months. And oh boy, have there been criticisms. Yes, I know I said I didn't want to talk about Half-Life Alyx ever again. Such hypocrisy, right guys? Whatever, it's my channel, I'll do what I want. Speaking of hypocrisy, that leads us nicely into our first topic. That being, how could I possibly perceive Black Mesa as a great game, yet believe Half-Life Alyx to be a terrible game? So my objective with the Canon video was to try to be a warning against extremes of storytelling, particularly in regards to Canon, that being what is true or what is false. To be a purist of some kind of source material is to engage in an extreme of stagnancy. For example, in the case of Half-Life, definitively stating that the best way to experience Half-Life is through Half-Life 1 and not through Black Mesa, a point which completely contradicts what I was trying to communicate in that video. That is one type of extreme with regards to Canon. But there is another extreme, that being the extreme of changing a story through retcons, effectively overwriting previously established facts and events. Because engaging in retcons is essentially the same thing as engaging in purism of a source material. In both cases, you're essentially making the statement of, this vision of the story is correct whilst this vision is not. And both can lead to equally toxic results. In the end, there needs to be a balance between these extremes. One in which you can allow your plot events and characters to move in different directions, whilst also remaining true to the core themes and ideas of your story. A balance between change and continuity. Unfortunately, to the dismay of my detractors, the line between change and continuity is ultimately going to be a matter of opinion. So, in my opinion, I think Black Mesa is great, precisely because of how it maintains that balance for me, keeping the core of the story the same, whilst shifting the tone, iterating upon emotional beats, and clarifying some details that weren't possible in the original game. On the other hand, I feel the exact opposite about Half-Life Alyx, because I find that game to be inherently a story of extremes. Because on one hand, you have this obsession with the enemies and icons and characters of Half-Life 2, trying way too hard to convince the audience that this is Half-Life, whilst at the same time retconning the ending of Half-Life 2 Episode 2, in a manner which completely trivializes the agency of a player character, an action which is anathema to both the idea of games and the core philosophy of Half-Life. The whole unforeseen consequences thing, yeah? So if Canon is dead as I claimed in my last video, then why did I have to go to such lengths to criticize Valve on Half-Life Alyx? Just why exactly did that critique matter? Why did I have to get so angry at Valve? Well, my first reason is that, while yes, there is no objective concept of canon, it is very much in the nature of companies to propagate a perception of canon. In an ideal world, gaming would be a very egalitarian medium, where any developer could make any game that they want, create any story that they want, and utilize any pre-existing fiction that they want. But the reality is that game development is hard, inasmuch as that it takes a substantial amount of time and resources, to the effect that a lot of the time, the only games that come out are the big games made by big companies. And oftentimes these games are the only games that the average person is going to know about. So it naturally lends itself to this idea that big company made it, therefore game is official, game is good, game is canon. In this climate of game development, it is all the more important to criticize these games, in order to evaluate if these developers maintain the balance between change of the new with the continuity with the old. Now, there are certainly a few other ways in which companies can maintain their grasp on this notion of a perceived canon, particularly in regards to the protections afforded by intellectual property law. As it stands, however, Valve doesn't necessarily flex their powers in this regard, but they are granted a great deal of implicit power on behalf of the community. You know, because why would Valve have to go out of their way to defend their own storytelling choices, when their community is more than willing to go to bat for them? Which leads to my second reason for making my Half-Life Alyx review. That being the state of games criticism is just terrible. I get a lot of comments to the effect of, oh, Half-Life Alyx Game of the Year, therefore you're wrong. Or, everyone else liked it, therefore you're just wrong. Thing is, criticism is not a democracy. When I look at all of these reviews that proclaim Alyx to be just the masterpiece that it is, almost all of them boil down to the same thoughts of oh, it's so breathtaking. It's just so great to be playing a new Half-Life game again. But the purpose of criticism is not to indulge the internet hive mind by circle jerking over how great the new game is. The purpose is, or at least one of the purposes is, to be actually critical, to evaluate the individual components of a work of art and conclude what works and what doesn't work. Which means there must be a willingness to shine a light into all of the dark flaws of any game, because facing those flaws head-on is the only way in which the medium of games can improve. At this point, I'm more than positive that there are going to be those toxic contrarians that are going to say, well, if we're supposed to be so critical, why weren't you critical about Black Mesa? Why didn't you talk about all the flaws in that game? Well, it's because that video was not intended to be a full review. But hey, if it'll appease the internet contrarians, then sure, let's actually talk about some of the flaws of Black Mesa. For example, I will admit that the weapons balancing is not as perfect as it could be. I do think that the Zen chapters don't make full use of the weapons sandbox as much as they could have. There's also quite a few changes I don't like that were made in the definitive edition. For example, reworking the music at the dam fight to be a continuous loop was a really bad idea, because it doesn't feel like that music was designed to be used in that manner, unlike the Zen chapters where the music does support a continuous loop. I also really don't like many of the desert rocks that they've added in. For those of you that don't live out here in the American Southwest, it's worth stating that if you go to any geological formation out here, like the Grand Canyon or Monument Valley or the Red Rocks of Sedona, or any other such place, you'll notice that there is a consistency to the layers within the geological formations, corresponding to the millions of years of geological history, compressed into these uniform patterns of limestone and sandstone and so on. So I'd say if a game wants to accurately represent the American Southwest, then it should largely follow these principles of geological formation. And honestly, for the most part, the 1.0 release of Black Mesa was largely consistent with this vision of uniform geological layers. For example, look at the texture work on this canyon area right here. I can pick a layer within this geological formation and find that it runs all along the rock face, which is pretty realistic. But the 1.5 release of Black Mesa adds in a whole bunch of rock geometry, which completely disrupts this logic. This iconic cliffside section is probably the most egregious example. If you look back at the 1.0 release, sure, this rock face wasn't particularly detailed. Sure, it's not graphically impressive, but it is rather believable compared to some of the rock faces you might find in real life. But the new rocks in 1.5 are the complete opposite of this. For me, they seem far too pointy and angular to possibly be the result of natural erosion. And there's no logic or consistency to how the layers within the rocks are organized. It's all just graphics for the sake of graphics, and it doesn't look real to me. So yes, there are some flaws within Black Mesa. It is not a perfect game. Now, as a consumer of games, I can deal with these flaws, because on one hand, I feel like the good of Black Mesa vastly outweighs the bad of Black Mesa. And on the other hand, most of these flaws are flaws that I can deal with on my own, either by rolling back to the 1.0 release or by modding the game files myself. But as a critic, I say that these gripes should be allowed to stand, because they are the beginning of a framework of improving games as an artistic medium. So what I saw with Half-Life Alyx was that virtually no one was willing to take a stand in terms of drawing attention to these flaws, either because they were so bedazzled by the VR that they didn't even care to be critical, or because their fanboyism for Valve or for Half-Life left them in such a state of Stockholm Syndrome to that they would defend the game no matter what. And that is a dangerous place for criticism to be. So when I see all the fanboys make statements like, "Oh, you just don't understand the purpose of VR," I call that out for what it is, as a patronizing sycophancy. And when you have people like Mr. Noah Caldwell-Gervais make statements like, "Well, it's okay for Half-Life Alyx to be flawed or incomplete, because it's just a prototype game," I call that out for what it is, as an uninformed, naive apologism. We must have higher standards than that. Otherwise, the medium of gaming will not improve. Instead, what will happen is that the discourse around games will decay until there is nothing left but crappy memes and SFM videos. Further, developers like Valve will be validated with regards to their own fallacious game design choices. And the game design practices which led to games like Half-Life Alyx will only continue. Which does segue nicely into my third and probably most important reason for making that video. That being to realize the fact that utilitarian game development is ultimately damaging and harmful in the long run. Sure, you could say that Half-Life as a whole rose out of the ashes of a utilitarian game design, but I personally believe that once you spend so much time investing into the world building and storytelling of a game, you then have an artistic responsibility to finish that story. Obviously, of course, Valve disagrees. So in the years following the success of Steam, the release of the Orange Box, and of Portal 2, Valve came to the realization that they no longer needed to release products in order to survive as a company. In such a climate, the motivation for a Half-Life sequel would no longer come from a need to tell a good story, but instead from a goal of needing to constantly innovate and to subvert expectations. And that is truly why we never got Half-Life 2 Episode 3. Of course, Valve would disagree with that statement. They'd say something to the effect of, well, it's the scope creep, you see. The scope of the project just kept running away from us where it would be too much to handle. But the real reason is that if they finish the story of Half-Life, then Half-Life, as an IP, no longer has the utility to innovate or to subvert expectations. So why finish the story when we can leave it at a perpetual cliffhanger? That way the fans will be perpetually on the hook, and it'll give us basically an unlimited amount of time to work on the next game that will be subversive and amazing. It is game development motivated by pure hubris. Additionally, the manner in which Valve decides what is innovative and subversive is incredibly toxic. It really boils down to how Valve interacts with its own community, or rather how it does not interact with its own community. Basically, Valve almost never creates a direct dialogue with its community, instead opting to leak pieces of content and ideas here and there, all the while quietly listening to all the sources of community discussion, allowing that to drive their designs. Now, this is not exactly news. In fact, Valve has gone on record stating that this is a strategy that they use. But I don't think I truly realized how toxic this behavior was until I saw one of Tyler McVicker's, aka Valve News Network's, streams, where he discussed an anonymous interview he had with a Valve employee. Basically, this employee spoke to the effect of, oh well, we love listening to all of the speculation videos that the community puts out, because if the community is correct in guessing what we're doing, that gives us motivation to completely change our designs. But if the community is totally wrong, that again gives us motivation to change our designs. Like, do you see where we're going with this? See, this is why Valve truly values the silence they have. Because if they truly engage in a dialogue with the community, then they can no longer make the claim of, oh, we made a total innovation, we totally subverted everyone's expectations. Once again, it is that hubris-driven game design. Of course, this is not something that they would publicly admit. What they would explain it as is a matter of, oh well, the twists and turns that we make internally would drive everyone insane, so we're just so much better off that we don't talk about our developments publicly. But the reality is that their own silence gives them creative power to appropriate the ideas of the community, either to directly use those ideas or to directly contradict them. It is truly Valve using our own passion for their games against us. Once you start to look at Valve through this lens, as a greater picture of a prideful company constantly trying to subvert expectations, and if they cannot be subversive, then they will literally do no more than the bare minimum amount of work required. Then so much of what they've done over the past years begins to make sense. You can see it with regards to Dota 2, in terms of their spotty commitment to the competitive scene of that game. You can see it within TF2, with regards to the rollouts of the End of the Line update, as well as the Jungle Inferno update. You can see it within a game like Artifact, where the game was very much marketed as an anti-Hearthstone. Yet when the game did not achieve the success that Valve intended, then lead designer Richard Garfield went out of his way to contradict the criticisms from the player base. And then you have this curious case where a major internal story rewrite of Half-Life Alyx coincided with the nuclear fallout of the release of Hunt Down the Freeman, almost as if Valve were trying really, really hard to distance themselves from the community. You know, because as long as you're doing the exact opposite of what the community is doing in their own crappy little projects, then surely that will be subversive, right guys? Which leads us straight back to the ending of Half-Life Alyx. From the perspective of lore and characterization, the ending of Half-Life Alyx makes no sense unless you're willing to accept the notion that the ending of Episode 2 was not only a mistake on the G-Man's part, but also a mistake of such an extreme degree that he had to deliberately go back in time, allow himself to be captured by the Combine, all for the purpose of recruiting Alex Vance. It just makes no sense to me. There is nothing about the story of Episode 2 that would suggest that the G-Man needed to act in such a manner, all in response to the death of one person, Eli Vance, a person who I'm not convinced he even cares about. The only way in which this ending makes sense is when you look at it from a more meta perspective. The greater utilitarian objectives of Half-Life Alyx, those being to justify the game's existence in VR, to pivot away from Mark Laidlaw's Epistle 3, and to tease at, but not necessarily confirm, a sequel. Once you begin to look at a game in this light, it's a very difficult mindset to get out of, which is why I remain very critical of what the G-Man says in this ending, because the statements he is making here are not truthful. This idea of getting the Combine off of Earth to be too large of a nudge. I mean, would it not be just a simple matter of Gordon Freeman not entering the test chamber? Because if that happened, then no experiment, no resonance cascade, no alien invasion. So to me, that's just not truthful. And then this notion of Gordon Freeman was unable or unwilling to do what the G-Man wants. The only fact that supports that would be the Vortigaunt intervention at the start of Episode 1. A plot point which seems more or less resolved by the end of the first act of Episode 2. Other than that, it does seem to me that Gordon Freeman is perfectly willing to go along with the G-Man. And even if the Vortigaunts are the problem, why would the G-Man turn to Alex Vance? Because as it is, the Vortigaunts seem equally interested in her as they are within Gordon Freeman. So the objective of hiring Alex Vance, would that not be equally as problematic? And assuming that these lies are intentional, why would he need to do that? I mean, he's never had to lie to other characters to get what he wants before, so why start now? It makes no sense to me, unless you interpret it from the utilitarian, metaphorical level, where the G-Man himself is a mouthpiece for the Valve writers. From this perspective, the statement of nudging the timeline to give Alex what she didn't know that she wanted seems like an easy metaphor for the shift away from Half-Life 3 into giving the community what they didn't know that they wanted, that being VR. And the notion of Gordon being unable or unwilling to do what G-Man wants, as kind of the statement of Valve shifting the blame off of themselves to justify why Half-Life Alyx took so long. Statements like these seem largely consistent with the type of statements that Valve has made before, within previous attempts to try to placate the community. And at this point, I'm fed up with it. I find it incredibly insulting. Now, assuming this interpretation is true, there has been some discussion as to what Gordon Freeman represents within this metaphor. If we assume, like I proposed, that Gordon Freeman is a stand-in for either the community or someone like Mark Laidlaw, which I still maintain to be a possibility, then, again, it is a massive slap in the face to all of the passion and dedication that the Half-Life community has shown to Valve all these years. However, some people have proposed that Gordon in this case is a metaphor for flat-screen games, that medium was unable to do what Valve wanted, so they had to push it to VR. Now, even if that is the case, it still smacks of this very prideful rhetoric of, well, no other gaming medium could do it, so we're going to do it, because we're the experts and we know what we're doing. You can only justify that kind of statement if Half-Life Alyx were truly an innovation, if it truly did capitalize upon the potential of VR. But that is most assuredly not the case, which we'll get back to that, don't worry. So for Valve to make this kind of statement, that flat-screen games couldn't do it, so we're going to do it in VR, it is a massive hypocrisy. So either way you try to interpret this, it is not a good look. But hey, we can sit here arguing about whether or not there is some secret, metaphorical, authorial intent until we're blue in the face. It will not change the fact that Half-Life Alyx was made with utilitarian intentions, and not with storytelling intentions. And I've seen a lot of discussion to the effect of, well, they had to change the story because Mark Laidlaw totally screwed them when he laid out his Epistle 3. The thing is, if you want to change the story, then just change the story. Just do something different. Maybe the Combine managed to utilize the Borealis, but it malfunctions in some way. Or maybe some third party completely destroys the Borealis. Or maybe Gordon Freeman does actually have to use the Borealis in order to go back in time to stop himself from going into the test chamber. Or maybe GLaDOS, for some reason, is on the Borealis. Whatever, just do something different. Use your creativity. But to have the G-Man completely undo the ending of Episode 2 sets a terrible, terrible precedent. Because if G-Man can just casually undo any event in the timeline, what is there to stop him from completely undoing any action that we, the player, may make in the future? Not only does it undermine good storytelling, it is completely contrary to the idea of a video game, and anathema to the themes of Half-Life. The very reason that we play games in the first place is to see how we, the players, can shape a game's story. Not to try to sit around and guess what some mysterious third party will do to try to change the timeline. And look, the problem is not with time travel, okay? Like, you can do good time travel stories, as long as the time travel feels truly justified, and as long as you're prepared to face the consequences of time travel. But really, neither of those is the case when you have the G-Man, who is unveiled to be totally able and willing to change the timeline over something as trivial as the death of one person. Like, this is truly smashing the Pandora's box of storytelling continuity. Once you've done this, then you're done. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Your storytelling credibility is completely shot. There is also a moral perspective to consider. Because I do believe that art, like video games, has the capacity to communicate moral messages, particularly when you have a story around a hero like Gordon Freeman, the kind of hero that can be very inspiring to impressionable young people. And I know this for a fact, because I have literally gone out to Comic-Cons cosplaying as Gordon Freeman. And when I have done that, there have been young kids, like 8 to 12-year-old boys, who have spotted me and called me out. Like, it's Gordon Freeman! That sort of thing. These are young boys who have identified Gordon Freeman as a heroic role model, because he truly is a hero. In fact, the very nature of Half-Life is to communicate the heroism of Gordon Freeman in a manner which only video games can communicate. And that is impressive. It seems natural that you have these kids who are inspired by Gordon Freeman, who feel like a hero by playing through Half-Life, who truly feel like they can be a hero and make a difference. Now imagine that you show these kids a playthrough of Half-Life Alyx on YouTube, because odds are they're not going to have the money to play the game themselves. So they see this playthrough of a game that they're not allowed to play, with a protagonist that is not Gordon Freeman. They come to the ending and they see that the G-Man completely altered the events of Episode 2. Now if these kids are in any way smart, they may very well come to the same conclusion that I have. That being, well, if the G-Man can undo that ending, then he can undo anything. Anything that Gordon has done in the past could be undone. And anything that he does in the future could be undone. Once they see this, they may very well come to a moral conclusion of, don't try to be a hero because anything that you do could be undone by some jackass in a blue suit. Regardless of whether Valve intended that moral or not, it is a terrible threshold to pass. And what makes it even worse is that you have this scene with Eli, where he hands you the crowbar and says, we've got some work to do, Gordon. To try to build up this image of the heroic Gordon Freeman, which stands in complete contradiction to the moral conclusion of this game. It is a vicious example of doublethink. That is, gaslighting your player base. So best case scenario, these kids are going to be very confused, I think. Worst case scenario, their faith in this idea of the heroic Gordon Freeman will be completely destroyed. And they may actually accept this toxic moral of don't try to be a hero as actually true and valid, which can be incredibly harmful, especially when you consider that the mental health of many young people is not in a great place right now. Like, that reason alone is enough for me to say that Half-Life Alyx is the worst game ever made. Even worse than trash like Hunt Down the Freeman. No, I am not being hyperbolic, I am not making a joke. Because even Hunt Down the Freeman, trash as it is, doesn't have an actively toxic moral. Like, if I were to try to think of a moral for Hunt Down the Freeman, it might be something to the effect of, don't make rash, bad faith deals with untrustworthy people. Which, it's fine, I guess. At the very least, it's not an actively harmful game, unlike Half-Life Alyx. This type of ending, where you completely destroy the power of your protagonist, all the while pretending to pay lip service to the glory of that protagonist, is the worst type of ending. It is a vicious, toxic failure of video game writing, and also a monument to the folly of utility-driven game design. And I absolutely will reserve the right to be pissed off, because this game truly deserves all the hate in the world. And I mean it. Fuck this game. But we are not done yet, are we? No, because we need to talk about the function of Half-Life Alyx as a flagship VR title. Since judging whether or not Half-Life Alyx achieved its goal as a flagship VR title was the fourth and final objective of my review. I have to say that I am disappointed that I have to reiterate this point. But apparently nuanced thoughts are beyond the grasp of the internet, so we're doing this again. The crux of my argument revolved around this notion of medium specificity, which is basically the notion that in order for a work of art to be successful, then it must necessarily capitalize upon the unique potential of the artistic medium in which it exists. For games in VR, this potential revolves around the dichotomy between immersion and believability. Now, I think I may have alluded to this in my very first video, this concept that immersion and believability are not the same thing. However, I will say that they are complementary parallel ideas, because there's no point in the process of immersing a player if the game world itself is not believable, right? So when I look at shock-like games like Prey or Deus Ex, I don't believe that the system-driven design that these games tout contribute to immersion, but I do believe that they create believability in the game worlds. So in that regard, system-driven designs were a very astute choice for those types of games. But those games being flat-screen games, the problem emerges that there's a finite cap to how complex these systems can be in the flat-screen gaming medium. But once you transition into the medium of VR, the potential for deep systems of gameplay is blown wide open. And since the technology of VR is inherently better at immersing a player compared to the technology of flat-screen games, the objective of a VR game should then be the creation of universal dynamic gameplay systems. Systems which implement the unique forms of interactivity that VR supports. Because those sorts of universal systems are what will create that sense of believability. If you can establish that believability, if you can convince the player that this game world is truly a world, and not just a mirage of holographic pixels, then that is when the potential of VR truly unlocks. But that is not what I saw in Half-Life Alyx. So when I say that Half-Life Alyx does not use the medium of VR, that is what I meant by that it did not truly capitalize upon the potential of its medium. A lot of people went out of the way to contradict what I said, with statements to the effect of, oh, well, you have the whiteboard thing here, and the hand crank puzzle there. You couldn't do that on a flat screen game, so you're wrong. While technically true, these are not systems of gameplay, because these kinds of mechanics are not applied uniformly throughout the game world. Go back to a game like Prey, because Prey is pretty much a gold standard for this kind of thing. Virtually every freestanding prop in Prey can be converted into a usable material through recycling. Or contrary-wise, every freestanding prop could be an alien mimic, lying in wait to attack. This is why games like Prey are so believable, because every object in the world has a potential for a meaningful gameplay consideration. Mechanics such as mimic attacks or recycling objects. These are not one-off gimmicks, but rather pervasive elements of the game's world. And that is truly the potential of a system-driven game design. Half-Life Alyx is not like this, because, for example, not every Combine force field, or not every Combine alarm bell, can be hacked into with a wiring toner puzzle. Those mechanics are not implemented in a systemic manner. So we come to this realization that all these puzzles that exist in Half-Life Alyx, all these little mechanics like the whiteboard, or the little holographic things, or the covering your mouth, These don't exist because factors of the world design demand that they be there, but rather because the game designer wanted them to be there, for some arbitrary purpose of pacing or making sure the player knows some information or whatever. And that is where Half-Life Alyx loses its potential, devolving from a completely new, authentic gameplay experience into just another scripted theme park ride. So sure, all these little puzzles and interactive bits, they do use VR, technically speaking, but in the end, they only exist to justify their own existence. They are not systems, but rather token gimmicks, ultimately shallow and self-serving. Of course, people insisted that I was wrong, saying that, well, if you just looked at the developer commentary, you'd see that they totally accounted for VR. Well, guess what? Specifically for the purpose of making this video, I sat through all of the Half-Life Alyx developer commentary. Would you like to know what I learned? Basically, little of value. So much of this commentary was focused upon, oh, we faced XYZ technical hurdle while making this game. But to me, this commentary only reinforced the fact that Half-Life Alyx was built upon a fundamentally flawed design philosophy. For example, there's this bit of commentary where the designers said, keeping the player and non-player characters separate presented its own challenges in VR. Now most of my detractors would point to that and say, oh look, see, they totally accounted for VR. But to me, this is a fundamental failure of a premise. No, you should not be trying to keep the player and non-player characters separate. What you should be trying to do is bring the player and non-player character together. That is where the potential of VR lies. A system of interactive gameplay where the player and non-player character engage with each other to create a novel gameplay experience, not possible within any other artistic medium. But the fact that there are no diegetic NPC interactions of any kind, no melee systems, no punching combines in the face, no high fives with your ally bros, no slapping off headcrabs that have attached themselves to you, nothing of that caliber. It just goes to show that Valve simply does not understand the potential of the VR medium, a medium which they pioneered. The very fact that they openly state that they were surprised that a player spent so much time interacting with a prop in the world, in a gaming medium whose very purpose is to promote interactions with props in the gameplay world, speaks volumes to just a fundamental misunderstanding of what VR is supposed to be. Instead, they were so focused on curating the experience, making sure the player absolutely got every piece of information and that everything happened like they expected, because God forbid that the player actually tried to play the game in the way the designer didn't intend, that the end result is just Half-Life 2 in VR. And that's not good enough. But even on this point, people have attacked me with arguments like, well, Half-Life Alyx is just as complex as Half-Life 2 was, so why are you being so critical of that game when Half-Life 2 was just the same game, you hypocrite? Again, you're not thinking in terms of medium-specific criticism. Sure, in theory, if I were to look at Half-Life Alyx and Half-Life 2 in a vacuum, to try to measure in an abstract sense which game was more or less complex, I think you'd find that both games are equally complex. But remember, games do not exist in a vacuum. Games exist within a medium, be they within flat screen or within VR. So in the case of Half-Life 2, even though that game does have some aspects that make it shallow, which I did mention in my original video, it is okay for that to be the case, because the nature of flat screen gaming demands that the player have some level of a suspension of disbelief. But if you transition into VR, the nature of the VR medium means that a suspension of disbelief is no longer necessary. The technology of VR naturally confers a heightened sense of immersion, so therefore the complexity and believability of a VR game must also rise to match that immersion. Otherwise, the game is going to feel shallow, which is exactly the case in Half-Life Alyx. Even though the game is theoretically as complex as Half-Life 2, in reality it feels more shallow, strictly because of the nature of the VR medium. The very nature of medium-specific criticism demands that a game like Half-Life Alyx rise to the potential of VR by the means of system-driven design. And I know people are going to say, well, they couldn't have done that because they only had 2 years to develop the game, and there would be too many technical hurdles. And you know what? I don't care. If you are going to spend so much time developing this new VR medium, then your flagship VR title must at least make the attempt to incorporate these kinds of systems. And let me make one thing clear. Because I know people are going to say something to the effect of, "Oh, you're just entitled fanboy crybaby who had unrealistic expectations and didn't get the perfect Valve, theoretical game that he wanted." Let me be clear. I never wanted Half-Life 3, nor did I ever want Half-Life Alyx, or anything of the caliber of some sort of pretentious, subversive, new game design that's going to totally change the industry forever. What I wanted was Half-Life 2 Episode 3, a conclusion to the story that began in Episode 1, because that is what Half-Life needs, a conclusion, no different than any other story in storytelling. However, if you're going to do what Valve did, if you're going to develop a new medium of gaming, all the while keeping your fanbase on the hook with a cliffhanger ending for over a decade, then whatever game you make must be consummate with both the time invested and also the potential of the new medium. That is not me being entitled, or me pushing the goalposts, or anything like that. It is simply a necessary criticism on what a flagship VR title should be. Otherwise, there's no point to any of this, and you may just as well have released Episode 3 all the way back in 2009, and be done with Half-Life forever. In fact, I honestly think we'd all be a lot better off if that were the case. I also hear this complaint that, well, you couldn't do those advanced VR mechanics in Half-Life Alyx, because it'd be too incomprehensible or people will get too motion sick. But really, you can say the same thing about flat-screen games. I mean, it may seem simple enough for you or me to play Half-Life 1 or Half-Life 2 on our computers right now, but perhaps try introducing those games to people who have never played a game before in their life. It's quite likely that they are going to find the experience to be completely incomprehensible, assuming that they don't get motion sick, which is definitely possible for some people. In a way, it does kind of bring up this question of gaming literacy, this idea of how do you read a game, as it were. How do you understand what a game is trying to present to you? And how do you tolerate the experience without getting motion sick? It is an interesting question, I will grant that. However, I don't believe it is the responsibility of a game to cater itself to a completely illiterate player. And the same rules apply for a VR game. There seems to be this prevailing notion that, well, if you just make Half-Life 2 in VR, it's an instant success. But really, what you're doing there is catering to those people that are illiterate to the systems of VR. And I don't believe that should be the function of a flagship VR title. Such a title should be trying to push the medium forward. And if some people get left behind, then so be it. But since Valve opted for the strategy of no pleb left behind, the result is that Half-Life Alyx has, at most, 3 systems of gameplay. Those being AI, physics, and just general shooting. The fact is, none of these systems are specific to the medium of VR, which means they can be implemented just as well, if not better, in flat-screen games. What's worse is that the few gimmicks that Half-Life Alyx does provide in this regard can be completely bypassed or mitigated by weapon mods. Laser sights, autoloaders, underbarrel grenade launchers. Mods like these completely trivialize the few advantages that Half-Life Alyx does have as a VR game. Therefore, in accordance with the idea of medium specificity, I'm forced to conclude that Half-Life Alyx has no reason to exist. So the long and short of it is, I made my Half-Life Alyx critique because I believed it was absolutely necessary to make it, and I continue to believe that. I should mention that I was not surprised that I made the kind of review that I did, because through all the years leading up to the release of Half-Life Alyx, all indications pointed to a game that would be technology first, story last. And when I saw Valve make their preliminary statements that you should experience previous Half-Life games before you jump into Half-Life Alyx, I knew 100% that they were going to fuck up the story of Half-Life with a pointless retcon. The state of Half-Life Alyx on launch was just as predictable to me as the state of, say, Cyberpunk 2077 on launch was to so many others. In fact, I'd say there's quite a few parallels between Cyberpunk and Half-Life Alyx. Both games have issues with toxic morals, and both games fail to utilize the medium of gaming to the best of their abilities. To me, the only real difference between these games was that Half-Life Alyx was, on one hand, far less buggy, and on the other hand, far more niche, which undoubtedly meant that the fanboys and sycophants would invariably rally to the defense of Half-Life Alyx. So I decided that I would take a stand and do what virtually no one else would do. And the result is that between that video and this one, you have the longest critique of Half-Life Alyx on this platform to date. And I am very proud that I was able to accomplish what I did. And I would do it again. Because this is not about subscribers, or clickbait, or likes or dislikes. It is a matter of principle. It is the necessity of criticism that I must air my grievances in regards to what is right and wrong in the gaming industry. And Half-Life Alyx is, without a doubt, an absolute wrong. Alright, now that that's out of the way, I think I'll address a few more minor criticisms. I got a few questions pertaining to the infamous Jeff joke, as to how it pertains relative to the previous jokes that Alyx has made, like the Zombine joke. How could I criticize this one joke but not this other joke? So let me say that I don't play Half-Life for the jokes, okay? As far as these games are concerned, I think humor is an element that should be used sparingly. Yes, I am aware that dark comedy does exist within the DNA of the original Half-Life. That being said, the reason I prefer Black Mesa over the original Half-Life is partially because it eschews this dark comedy aspect, in favor of a gritty horror aspect, most of the time. However, humor can be useful when used in the right context. So with that in mind, let's go back to the Zombine joke within episode 1. Why do I feel that this joke works? Here's a few reasons. First off, like I said, we have the context. This joke takes place during a period of relatively calm exploration. There is a bit of tension in that you're exploring a dark space, and you have a limited amount of flashlight power, but overall it's far more agreeable to introduce a joke here than it would be to introduce a joke during a period where the player is stressed out from a difficult mechanic or a combat encounter, since in that case you're just as likely to piss off the player as you are to amuse them. A second factor here is that Alyx is the one making the joke, not Gordon Freeman, aka not the player character. This is important because if the player tends to disagree with that joke, it doesn't create an issue of character diegesis. In other words, it doesn't risk the player disagreeing with the emotions of their player character, and in turn feeling disconnected from their player character. The third reason why this joke works is because it is self-aware. To clarify, the actual punchline of this joke is not the word Zombine itself, because the word Zombine is just not funny. Like, you'd have to be literally 5 years old to think Zombine was funny. No, what's actually funny about this is that moment when Alyx realizes that Gordon is not responding to the joke. And Alyx has that moment of like, oh, yeah, that was kind of stupid, wasn't it? Oh, okay, sure. You know, that sort of awkward moment that endears us to her character. And that's what's funny. This ties into the final reason why this joke works, and that's because of characterization. Compare this scene to a scene about 15 minutes earlier, where Alyx and Gordon are confronting the train car full of stalkers. And we see that Alyx Vance is clearly distraught by what's in front of her. Putting these two moments together creates something of an emotional tolerance spectrum for Alyx Vance. You know, because most people in the real world have a kind of a spectrum of what is and is not okay to joke about, or for what is and is not funny. So in episode 1, by combining these two moments together, we get kind of a picture of, okay, so this corpse of a Combine soldier with a head crab on him, you know, that's okay to joke about that. But these atrophied husks of enslaved civilians, that's a line too far. You can't joke about that. And from what we know about Alyx Vance through Half-Life 2 and the episodes, it makes sense. But the whole "Jeff, are you okay?" joke that Alyx makes in Half-Life Alyx has none of these redeeming qualities. Having the joke be spoken by the player character, combined with the fact that it is spoken immediately after a stressful gameplay encounter, not only creates a high risk of pissing off the player, but also of breaking their sense of immersion, of feeling like they are playing as this character. Which is precisely what happened to me. It's not a particularly self-aware joke, because Alyx Vance is the only person present at that moment, which leads me to believe that the writers intended for us to be laughing alongside her. And it certainly does not create a consistent characterization, unless you really expect me to believe that this is the same Alyx Vance, who openly expressed being afraid of the dark, to the extent where she pleaded with Russell to tell her a story so that she would not be afraid of the dark. No, that's not a believable character. Now some people will try to defend this as, oh well, that's just how she deals with stressful situations, that's all. And sure, that may be a valid point, if we were talking about a blood psychopath, or at the very least someone who was desensitized to violence. But for a relatively ordinary 19-year-old woman who has just recently killed off the most threatening creature she has ever encountered in her life so far, presumably, and who is probably dealing with the massive amounts of adrenaline fight-or-flight response, then no, dude, no ordinary human being would act in this manner. But I know more people will try to defend this as, oh well, it's all part of her character arc, you see. She's just developing into a different character from this game into Half-Life 2. The thing is, unless Valve is going to do another prequel game after Half-Life Alyx, then you cannot use the character development card to explain away differences between Half-Life Alyx and Half-Life 2. If you're going to do character development, you have to do it within a single game, and you have to do it in a believable manner. And no, transitioning from Alex Vance scared in the dark to Alex Vance making crude dad jokes at the sight of a mutilated corpse over the course of a few hours, that's not a character arc, that is schizophrenia. I want to tie this back to this whole discussion of a video game protagonist as a heroic figure. I already mentioned this idea in regards to Gordon Freeman, and with regards to Gordon Freeman, I will be coming back to this topic. However, I think that Alex Vance can also quite easily fit this role of a heroic figure. I know that, or at least I presume that, Half-Life as a whole isn't particularly popular with many women gamers. But for the few young women who have played Half-Life 2, something tells me that they would probably look fondly upon the scene where Alex introduces Gordon to Dog, and goes on to explain that, oh, I've been building him up ever since he was a little puppy dog. It would not surprise me at all if there were some women who reacted to this in a manner of, hey, that's me, I want to do that. So therein lies the potential for Alex Vance to be a heroic figure for young women in terms of being a skilled mechanic and a reasonably skilled combatant. This is where game mechanics come in, because the very nature of games means that a game with strong gameplay mechanics will invariably reflect upon the strengths of the protagonist. That's why Gordon Freeman feels like the hero that he is, because of solid mechanics and solid set pieces. But the inverse is also true. Bad game mechanics can reflect negatively upon the capabilities of a bad protagonist. It's one of the reasons I came down so hard on the puzzles of Half-Life Alyx, because they don't make me feel like a skilled technician. They make me feel like a chimpanzee with a 2x2 Rubik's Cube, and that is an incredibly trite experience. Combine this with the fact that the shooting of Half-Life Alyx makes me feel less like a guerrilla fighter and more like a fat Gordon Freeman, and the fact that Alex's actions rarely drive the plot, and oftentimes when they do drive the plot, it's because of random dumb luck. The result is that Alex Vance does not feel heroic. Combine that with all of these stupid jokes in this game, which at best are annoying, and at worst make Alex Vance look like a complete psychopath. The result is that you have a protagonist with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Not only is that bad for a gaming protagonist, not only is that a massive disservice to the character that we've known for so long, but it's also just bad representation. And because gaming has very few female protagonists, and even fewer good female protagonists, the result is just not a good look for gaming. Like, frankly, I'm shocked that the likes of Anita Sarkeesian haven't already tried to take this game to task, to tear it apart for all that it's worth. Although, hey, knowing the state of the industry these days, it's probably just as likely that Anita Sarkeesian specifically consulted Valve to write Alyx in this manner. Who knows? It certainly would not surprise me. But a disappointment regardless. On the topic of world building, I got a few comments to the effect of, well, you missed out on these aspects of the world building because there was this Vortigaunt mural painting here, or this Vortigaunt with a brain injury that looks like he was part of an experiment, and who looks like he has some weird perception of time. But these details, it's not that I failed to mention them, or even failed to notice them, it's that they were not worth mentioning. Remember that Valve specifically recommended that people play the previous Half-Life games before playing Half-Life Alyx. So the designer expectation here is that players of Half-Life Alyx should have already known plot details of the previous Half-Life games. And from that point of view, we already know that the Vortigaunts worship Gordon Freeman. We know that they have this weird non-linear relationship with time. We know that the Combine do brutal experiments on the Vortigaunts. So for Valve to reintroduce all of these elements here, really it's not progress. You're just recycling information that we already know. Like, we should not be applauding Valve just because they know how to copy their own homework. And as for Russell ruminating and reminiscing about old Earth, like, who cares? I do not care about that. We are already living on that Earth right now. I don't need Half-Life Alyx to reiterate that information for me. What I want is for there to be new information, new details that really build upon what we knew beforehand, or that can truly recontextualize things that we already knew, without the brutal sledgehammer of retcons. That is why I was so focused and so critical about the new details that Half-Life Alyx added, because world building done well can truly enrich a story, but world building done poorly can truly destroy a story. So when you consider that the Citadel being built on Earth, from Earth resources, doesn't make sense from a perspective of an interdimensional Combine civilization, the fact that our current Resistance members have given little, if any, consideration to acquiring these replicator units of technology, and the fact that the Combine seem nearly incapable of controlling their borders when it comes to alien infestations, the end result is just stupidity. What Valve has done is created a world that feels less believable than it was before. Additionally, I'll mention that the very setting of Half-Life Alyx as a prequel offers natural opportunities to fill in gaps within the Half-Life lore, and for Valve to forego those opportunities in favor of this whole subverting expectations crap, not only is it a disservice to the long-standing story, but also to the story of Half-Life Alyx itself. For example, I'd like to specifically go back to this concept of Gordon Freeman, the heroic figure. Yep, I told you we'd talk about that again. Well, here we are. A few people have called me out on a technicality, saying that, well, no, you can't call Gordon Freeman a folk hero, because if he were a real folk hero, then he would be known by literally everyone. Yes, this is technically true. However, I maintain that the language of Half-Life 2, the language around Gordon Freeman, does promote a heroic idea, regardless of whether it's a civilian announcing the return of Gordon Freeman, or a Combine administrator warning against the return of such a hero. I would like to return our attention to this Breen cast in Half-Life 2, because there are some key details in what Breen is trying to communicate. He specifically mentions Gordon having
an almost messianic reputation in the minds of certain citizens. And yet unsophisticated minds continue to imbue him with romantic power, giving him such dangerous poetic labels as the one free man, the opener of the way.
Now, first of all, if it were just Eli and Kleiner and his friends who knew about Gordon Freeman and who were spreading this idea of Gordon Freeman the hero, then I don't think Breen would be using the language of unsophisticated minds. As much of a traitor and collaborator that Breen is, he doesn't strike me as the sort of person to insult his former colleagues in such a manner. Second of all, regarding the messianic reputation bit, you could argue that there is a bit of embellishment of language. But in this particular scenario, I think he is being more honest than not. The fact that he has taken such a serious tone of voice, combined with the fact that he chose to publish such a broadcast a mere few hours after Gordon Freeman arrived, suggests to me that he takes this very seriously, which does imply that there are citizens that see Gordon Freeman as a potential savior, and that the further propagation of that idea of Gordon Freeman the savior would be disastrous for the Combine's work. Otherwise, if Gordon truly were a nobody, then why would he go to such an effort? Now, from a writing perspective, I get why Valve chose to do this, because obviously it promotes this idea in the player's head that, wow, I'm a protagonist, I know I'm going to do something important here. Which, makes sense if you're trying to make your player feel like a hero. However, it is very much a top-down way of writing, in that it's sort of imposing this idea of a hero from a designer perspective, and not necessarily organically from a world-building perspective. Of course, this is mitigated somewhat by Gordon Freeman becoming well-known by blowing up Nova Prospekt. Regardless, I do think that good writing demands that we examine where this idea of Gordon Freeman the Messiah, Gordon Freeman the hero, comes from, and also maybe whether or not there was a counter-rhetoric from the Combine. Again, let's go back to this broadcast where Breen says,
"Let me remind all citizens of the dangers of magical thinking."
The remind you bit implying that there were previous discussions about magical thinking, which may or may not have involved discussions around heroes like a theoretical Gordon Freeman. A prequel game like Half-Life Alyx would be the perfect opportunity to explore these ideas in great detail. Of course, my detractors will object, saying that, Well, you had enough of that in Half-Life 2. Half-Life Alyx has no obligation to talk about that. It has no obligation to add those types of world-building details. Okay, sure, maybe this is true. But at the same time, I could just as easily say that Crowbar Collective had no obligation to make Black Mesa in its entirety. But they did. And because of their ability and willingness to add these world-building details that simply weren't possible before, they have created, in my opinion, regardless of the flaws, to date the finest iteration of Half-Life to ever exist. If Half-Life Alyx had this kind of world building, then its story would have been elevated in a similar manner. Again, I would have specifically liked to have seen more of this rhetoric surrounding Gordon Freeman, from the perspectives of the Combine, the civilians, and the Resistance. Where did this idea of Gordon Freeman the Savior come from? Did the Combine have a propaganda machine, painting Gordon Freeman as a villain? How many citizens bought into that kind of rhetoric? Aside from civil protection, were there other factions of Combine sympathizers and collaborators? All of these are great questions that Half-Life Alyx had the potential to answer, but the fact that it does not answer them makes the game feel barren. Sure, there's a magazine here and a propaganda poster there, and a few lighthearted discussions sprinkled about, but really nothing substantive to sink your teeth into. Not only is that a disservice to world building, but it also weakens the story that Valve has in the game right now. Once again, I'd like to call attention to that penultimate reveal moment, where the prisoner within the vault is allegedly Gordon Freeman. Now, twist or no twist, it is once again that sort of top-down philosophy of dropping the name of Gordon Freeman to motivate the player, because the player knows that Gordon Freeman is a hero that's going to fix everything. As functional as that may be, having Alyx and her full crew immediately on board with rescuing Gordon Freeman seems really shallow to me. Like, I don't buy it as an authentic character motivation. If Half-Life Alyx had been doing its job regarding the world building, discussing the myths and propaganda around Gordon Freeman, who is he friend or foe, then that could inform Alyx's motivations as to whether or not she truly wants to rescue Gordon. You could have a discussion be something like, "Hey, Eli, I know you're my dad and all, and I know Gordon Freeman was your best bud, but he was kind of responsible for that whole Resonance Cascade thing, right? Is letting him go really a good idea? Like, I know those Vortigons really worship him, but man, those Vortigons are real kooky whack jobs. I'm not exactly sure I trust them either. And hey, it sure has been a long time since you've seen Gordon Freeman. What could have possibly happened to him to have warranted so much security from the Combine? Is letting him go really the best course of action?" That kind of discussion could have really gone a long way to making Alyx Vance feel like a character. And as far as the G-Man twist is concerned, actually having everyone discuss Gordon Freeman in such a serious, intense manner would actually make that twist more impactful, since it might distract some players from the smaller hints that would suggest G-Man instead of Gordon. But as it is, twist or no twist, the big name drop of Gordon Freeman is nothing more than fan service. A glorified dog whistle to motivate the player. It's certainly functional, to be sure, but from a writing perspective, it is also equally boring and lazy. So how would I change the story and gameplay of Half-Life Alyx? Seems like a natural enough question. Before I answer that, though, I think I'll have to answer the corollary question of why wasn't I more constructive in my initial Half-Life Alyx review? I'm sure some people are thinking along the lines of, "Wow, why you gotta be so negative, bro? Why can't you be more constructive? Why can't you be more positive? Why can't you offer up some of your own ideas?" And here's why. Again, it all ties back into this whole idea of how Valve interacts with its community, in that they don't actively participate in a dialogue with the community unless absolutely necessary, but rather they prefer to listen in from the background, picking up on the community's ideas to either appropriate directly into some of their updates or games, or to directly contradict or go against those ideas, in the name of subverting expectations, all the while presenting this air of pretentiousness that all of these ideas were theirs alone, that in the end, they're the experts, they know what's best. In other words, it's our ideas, our passions, used against us. Now, obviously, I do not work at Valve, and unless they plan on hiring me as a game design consultant, which is not something I'd want from them anyway, then I do not want them profiting off of my ideas, which is why in my initial review, I specifically avoided making any suggestions on how to improve the game, Not just because there is no critical obligation to offer such advice, but also because I do not want Valve using my ideas for free. Of course, this is all assuming that Valve even bothered to watch my initial review, which is doubtful, to be honest. That said, I do find it interesting that I claim Half-Life Alyx to be a failure, and then in the developer commentary, Gabe Newell states, "Ultimately, whether we succeeded or not is up to you to decide." Not feeling so confident, are we, Gabe-in? Regardless, it's been a year. Valve has most likely moved on to other projects, so I figure I might as well give my take on how I would improve the game, if for no other reason than to dissuade the internet trolls of the notion that I have no idea what I'm talking about. So let's start this off with a few assumptions. First assumption is that we are stuck with the overall G-Man in the vault plot and that we have to break him out. Second assumption is that we are stuck with Alyx Vance as a voiced protagonist. Now, again, I do not like either of these designs. I think they're both relatively stupid in their own regards, but let's assume for the moment that they are fundamental constants to the premise of Half-Life Alyx. With that in mind, how would I change Half-Life Alyx? First thing would have to be a shift in the gameplay design. Specifically, the interactive VR components would have to be shifted away from token gimmicks and onto core systems of gameplay. Now, there are a number of ways in which you could try this. You could take inspiration from shock-like games like Prey and Deus Ex. You could follow the Boneworks route of having more fleshed out melee and climbing systems. My personal recommendation, however, is to focus upon NPC interactions. Again, it is my opinion that interacting with other characters is the real untested frontier of VR. So I would suggest that the gameplay of Half-Life Alyx might focus upon interactions with one NPC companion. Of course, the fanboys are going to come out and say, well, you can't do that because Valve said so in their developer commentary that human NPCs are just way too complex. Okay, fine. So the logical conclusion to that would to make this companion a non-human character. Maybe he's some kind of mechanical robot ally, perhaps one that has already been pre-established within the Half-Life lore. I wonder, boys and girls. I truly wonder which character in Half-Life could possibly fit this requirement. Yeah, of course, you guys know who I'm talking about here. Dog. I say that the moment-to-moment story and gameplay of Half-Life Alyx should focus upon the relationship between Alyx and Dog. Now, there's all sorts of stuff that you could try with this sort of premise. You could command Dog directly in combat. You could have him assist you with certain puzzles in the environment. You could have him assist you in navigation. You could also incorporate a resource system, where maybe Dog takes damage from battle, and you have to look for components in the environment to repair him, or perhaps for technology to upgrade his capabilities. You could incorporate a detail where Dog literally grows in size because of all of the components that Alyx is throwing onto him. Implementing VR interactivity on such a character that is constantly helping you throughout the entire game would truly create a core system of VR gameplay, thereby fulfilling upon my requirement of medium specificity. Also, if done correctly, it would go a long way to making Alyx Vance feel like a cunning technician that she was shown to be in Half-Life 2. And it could also justify the decision behind a voiced protagonist, because you could have some flavorful moments of interaction with Alyx and Dog. Overall, I do not believe that it would be an insurmountable task for Valve to design the gameplay in such a manner. In fact, I say that they already established a baseline for those sorts of mechanics in their other VR tech demos, like that whole aperture robot repair thing, or that whole sign language game design thing that they were talking about so many years ago. Now, before I continue, can I just say how disappointing it is that Dog was virtually nowhere to be found within Half-Life Alyx? You know, Dog, who is supposed to be this loyal, steadfast companion to Alyx Vance. Like, really, it boggles my mind. You could not have conceived of a greater missed opportunity than to not have Dog in this game. Anyway, the second thing I'd address with regards to Half-Life Alyx would be to address all of the lore and world-building problems that I mentioned before. I've already stated my piece with regards to world-building, so I won't repeat myself here. The third thing I'd change would be a complete and total rewrite of the game's ending, after Alyx Vance frees the G-Man. In my mind, the new ending would go like this. Firstly, I try to tone down the whole monologue about how G-Man is nudging the timeline, in an attempt to try to make his motivations not seem too transparent. Next, instead of this whole pretentious, well, what if I gave you something you didn't know you wanted? How about, When Alyx asks G-Man to remove the Combine from Earth, G-Man actually decides to give her what she wants. Sort of. What I mean to say is that G-Man decides to show Alyx Vance what would happen if the Combine never invaded Earth in the first place. The end result would be something like It's a Wonderful Life meets Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where Alyx receives a new vision of the present, where Earth is completely destroyed. Have G-Man explain that the portal storms coming out of Black Mesa would have continued and intensified to such a degree that they would completely tear the planet apart. Now, at this point in the Half-Life continuity, we really do not know just how much information Eli has divulged to Alyx with regards to the whole Black Mesa incident. This is something that G-Man could take advantage of. G-Man could reveal to Alyx that Eli was very much responsible for the events of Black Mesa. This would be framed in a manner such that Alyx's frustrations about the Combine being on Earth are being shifted onto Eli himself. Because in a sense, Eli is very much responsible, much more so than Gordon ever was. It is at this moment when G-Man makes his offer. Have him say something to the effect of, "Well, you have my condolences, but there are always opportunities to change the future. I could offer you such opportunities, Alyx Vance." Now, instead of Alyx Vance being forced into an agreement, she then chooses to accept his offer. As this conversation is being wrapped up, G-Man then performs a partial memory wipe on Alyx, such that she remembers all this new information, but does not remember G-Man. And then Alyx is back on Earth. You can do some sort of post-credit sequence where she's trying to come to grips with all this new information, maybe have a brief little confrontation with Eli, have her say, "Hey Dad, you need to tell me about Black Mesa." And then that's it. Game over. So here's what this new ending would accomplish. First thing is that we avoid retconning Episode 2 altogether. Again, the value of a prequel should not be on its ability to retcon old content. The value must lie within its ability to add new information, or to recontextualize information relative to things that we already know. And on that note, the next thing that this ending would accomplish would be to give more motivation to the Combine. As it is, we really don't have that much in-game information as to why the Combine chose to invade us in the first place. Sure, we know about there was a 7 Hours War and that Earth surrendered, but as far as core motivations go, there's really not much there. It's just, Combine are dicks, so shoot 'em, I guess. But having it explained that the Combine stabilized the portals coming out of Black Mesa adds some needed nuance to that faction, such that it's not just invasion for the sake of invasion, but rather that they have a mandate to control portal technology, lest these portal storms rage out of control to tear apart entire realities. Thirdly, this would recharacterize the G-Man and his actions in a manner that's consistent with what we know from Episode 2. And finally, this ending improves the character of Alyx Vance, because yeah, while she is still being gaslit by the G-Man, having her choose to work with him instead of being forced to work with him makes her feel like a character with actual agency. Perhaps a small thing, but it does make her a better protagonist, and therefore a better female protagonist. Alright, well I think I've covered all the pertinent avenues of feedback. But the truth is, guys, I could go on. For every hour that I record this, not a single one goes by where I don't think of some aspect in which Half-Life Alyx fails to meet the narrative and gameplay standards of Half-Life 2. But you should get the picture by now. After considering all of the arguments, all of the feedback, and all of the developer commentaries, my conviction that Half-Life Alyx is a failure of game design and storytelling is stronger than ever. But if I haven't convinced you of that point of view by now, then I doubt I ever will. But before you completely write off my opinion as nothing more than just the ravings of a madman, consider this. Some time ago, IGN released a video where Robin Walker, along with a few other Half-Life 2 programmers, reacted to a community speedrun of Half-Life 2. Now just listen to what they have to say.
Keep asking ourselves, would they like us to fix some of these?
To make it more interesting.
I think Jay proposed, what if we fixed all the bugs they're using, 1 week before the next, game's done quick or something.
To sort of just change the meta.
Oh yeah, sure, Robin Walker, sure, you should totally do that. You should totally do a speedrunning patch to Half-Life 2. It's not as if you have anything better to do, and it's certainly not as if that would waste the community's time with regards to trying to preserve older versions of Half-Life 2. No, dude, you should totally go ahead and do that. 100%. Absolutely. And before people try to explain this away as, oh, he was just making a friendly developer joke, dude. No, just no. Look, if I were to wake up tomorrow to find that there were a speedrunning patch applied to Half-Life 2, which completely upsets the community's efforts to try to make speedruns of Half-Life 2, I would not be surprised in the slightest. I would certainly be disappointed, make no question about that, but I would not be surprised. Because this is the mindset of Valve developers. Instead of engaging in good storytelling, instead of providing adequate support to their current multiplayer titles, instead of addressing things like the current bot crisis within TF2, they would rather go back to a 10-year-old single-player game, a game which is otherwise feature complete, in order to add some sort of speedrunning patch. A patch which nobody wants, nobody asked for, and which would do nothing but waste everyone's time. This is not the path forward for healthy game development. And if neither Valve nor the community can recognize this, then I have no hope for the future of this company as a game developer. Speaking of which, let's talk about the future. For any future content on this channel, if I have to discuss Half-Life again, then the statement of Half-Life Alyx is a bad game will be taken as axiomatic from now on. It will be a permanent frame of reference for all future discussions. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but it is something you will have to tolerate in one form or another if you plan on sticking around on this channel. If you cannot do that, if you aren't even convinced that that is what I truly believe, if you think this is all nothing more than a fruitless attempt at clickbait, then, well, thanks for watching, I guess, but it's probably high time that you leave. Moving forward, I will continue my standing boycott on purchasing Valve products. I do not plan on buying any of their future titles, nor do I plan on spending any money on microtransactions on their current titles. Now, will I cover the theoretical Half-Life 3 on this channel? Maybe, but such coverage would likely be a story-only review, because I doubt I will have any desire to play that game myself, or any other future Valve Half-Life title. Nor will I likely have any desire to support Valve as a company. Of course, the fanboys will attack me with comments like, well, you can't be so harsh on Valve. Valve is changing. They'll make better Half-Life games in the future, promise. Even Robin Walker himself has made comments to the effect of, well, we don't want Half-Life to be stuck in a narrative limbo anymore. But allow me to draw an analogy here. If a folk tale is a story of a boy who cried wolf, then the tale of Valve is the story of a gay Ben who cried Half-Life. At some point, you have to stop listening to them. That point being when they have lost all credibility. And that is precisely where Valve is right now. Because Valve, like the deluded con men that they are convinced that the pain of the ending of Episode 2 can simply be wiped away with a snap of their fingers, and that we should all be so complacent in that course of action. But they are most assuredly wrong, because I refuse to let go of Episode 2, and I will continue to refuse, even if it means I must stand alone against the entire Half-Life community. Because I understand that the pain of that ending is not meant to be wiped away so simply, and that to do just that would be to invite an even worse fate. A fate filled with gameplay that is at best mediocre, along with storytelling that is bereft of passion and devoid of logic. Half-Life 3, assuming that it ever exists, will undoubtedly be fruit from the poisonous tree. And should you, the Half-Life community, be poisoned by such a fruit, then let the record state that I will not shed a single tear in response to your pain, because when that day comes, you will have no one to blame but yourself.